Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mass Communication 310. This is part two of week 5 on visuals. In this video, we'll be going over how we can use and make illustrations for graphic design. Now, illustrations, like photography, are an important part of graphic design because they help us tell our stories visually. Illustrations allow you to add a lot of personality to a design. It allows you to demonstrate things sometimes better and more simplistically than a photograph can. It allows you to target audiences more specifically with the type of illustration that you're using. It can show what can't be seen. For instance, if you're trying to visualize an idea, something that happened prior to photography, or even a fantasy type idea, if you're trying to portray, a witch or a goblin or whatever it may be. Illustrations really give you a broad range of creativity in being able to depict what you want your audience to see. When we're choosing illustrations, we really need to consider the ultimate purpose of the illustration. Is the purpose to entertain, draw attention, inform? Is it meant to really give our audience a new idea of an ideal world? So, knowing the purpose of the illustration is going to affect the type of illustration that you need to pick. In addition, you need to think back to your branding. Remember that illustrations have their own mood, feel, and even tone. And so we want to make sure that the tone of the illustration really matches the brand voice and the brand visuals that we have come up with back in week two's lesson. You also want to consider what kind of audience you have when using illustrations. People react to illustrations differently. And so, having an illustration that's too simplistic for an adult audience may make them feel like you're talking down to them. So, making sure that you have illustrations that are appropriate for your audience as well as your medium is really important because having illustrations that are good for your medium, whether it's print or broadcast, social, digital. These are really critical decisions when it comes to choosing what type of illustration you're going to use. Now, there are many different types of illustrations. Your textbook and readings really define these in terms of various types. I think the best way to think about it is in terms of digitally created illustrations and hand created illustrations. When we're thinking about the art world, digital and hand drawn art are two very different types of mediums and they have different purposes. And so, if we can understand a little bit about those, it will help us in our choices for what type of illustration we should be using. Vectors are very flat, plain images, and not plain in terms of their ability to convey, but in the types of subjects that we are meaning to demonstrate. Vector images actually use formulas based on computerized design that make it so all of the elements of the image work in tangent with one another. And so you will see these kind of looking very blockish. Vector images tend to be flat and made up of a bunch of shapes. And so vector images are very good for matter of fact subjects. There is a lot of stock vector images available from places such as Shutterstock or Getty Images, the same place where you'd be getting your stock photography from. And vector images are good if you are just a beginning illustrator because you're really using already set shapes in order to design something. So, most designers and illustrators use and create vectors through Adobe Illustrator, although there are certainly other types of programs that you can use to create vector images. Now, freehand digital allows the designer to have more possibility within the type of illustration. These tend to be a lot smoother than vectors because instead of using very defined shapes, it's going to be a lot more natural than a vector image would. And so it allows you to create the look of a hand designed illustration, but within a digital platform. I think one of the newest programs that particularly a lot of young adult illustrators are using is Procreate, where you're using, an iPad or other types of digital tablet in order to use a digital pencil like the Apple Pencil to create your illustration just like you would with another brush or pencil art form. And so, a lot of these illustrations, it can be hard to differentiate between whether this was hand drawn or digitally created. It's just mainly knowing what program they came from. You can also do these types of things in Illustrator and Photoshop, but like I said, Procreate is an excellent program to play around with if you have not actually done so. And freehand digital illustrations are actually some of the most widely used, particularly in digital storytelling and news. You can see this freehand digital piece that was created for the Washington Post. Now, hand drawn or drawn images are those that use actual art, but instead of it being art for art's sake, it's art for a purpose. You are telling the artist what to do. So there's little artistic license when it comes to asking for illustrations that are hand drawn drawings. And so the main idea is that you're using art to tell a story. It allows more control. You can customize the art a lot more, but it does take artistic talent to actually sit there and draw it. In addition, you also have to then digitize the final product to ensure that the drawing can be used within digital design platforms. And so making sure that you have the right kind of digital format is really important as well. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, other forms of art that are very common within graphic design, particularly right now in modern design, are pen and gouge. These combine paint and bright colors with pen and hard brush strokes. They really provide a lot of life to your design. They are eye catching. They use very strong lines. They are good for digital in terms of sizing, but again, these do take artistic talent to make. You are usually first working with pen, paper, and paint, and then digitizing them. But through Procreate and other digital platforms, you're able to mimic the style of pen and gouge in digital illustration. And that's actually becoming more of the preferred way to illustrate. You can also do loose line and sketch illustrations. These are known as more subtle. There are ways to show movement. These are very common within fashion illustrating, but they can also be used well for brainstorming ideas. A lot of loose line and sketch is now being combined to actually make animation as well. And so that's something to consider if you're going into animation and video illustration, then knowing how to do loose line and sketch is very important. Again, you could create a sketch or a loose line illustration in a program like Procreate, or you could hand draw it and then digitize it. Now, when we're talking about digitizing illustrations, it's important to know the different types of digital illustration. A vector, as we've talked about, is a very flat surface. And so you can see on the left-hand side that there is really no 3D element to a vector image. It is flat, it is made up of shapes. You can get very detailed effects within a vector image, but the vector is flat. Meanwhile, a raster image allows you to have more depth, even though it's still a 2D image. It gives you the feeling of it being more lifelike, where an animation or a 3D illustration is done in a way that you can see all around the subject and turn it with things like augmented reality and mixed reality. It is very important that begin to understand and use animation in 3D more within our graphic design. Now, when we're talking about vector formats, the digital file types that we need to use, printers and digital designers are very particular about what kind of format the illustration needs to be. If you are using illustrations to create printed materials, you're going to need an EPS version of your vector. The reason for this is that these are very high quality versions of the graphic, but they are so high quality that they contain too much information for you to upload it to a website for accessibility purposes. If you are using a work in progress, let's say you and a teammate are sharing a file back and forth on a design, then you're going to want to use an AI file. These are Adobe Illustrator files, and you should never use an AI file for your final version of the image because they are hard to open on digital and you cannot print from them. Meanwhile, a PDF can be displayed anywhere, and they are the preferred final version, not only for printing regular things like flyers as opposed to big billboards, which would require an EPS, but a PDF also allows for printing lines, and it can be open in digital websites. And so it really is a very versatile type of digital file for vectors. For raster formats, there are JPEGs, PNGs, PSDs, and TIFFs. You may be familiar with these, but not know the difference between them, and it's important that we do. A JPEG is a very versatile type of digital file. It has very high resolution, but it can also be compressed to be smaller, but they're not very easy to edit. So when you're bringing a JPEG into Photoshop or Illustrator, it can be harder to work with these files than others. So if you know that you need to edit a digital file, you really want to make it a PNG. This will allow you to do things like having transparent backgrounds, doing cutouts. These PNG files are typically pretty small, but they allow you to have nice, vibrant colors, and they are easier to edit than JPEGs. Again, if you're working on something with a teammate in an in progress setting, you're going to want to use a Photoshop file, which is a PSD. Again, do not use these as your final product, similar to the AI file on the vector images. And then if you're printing something very large, your printer is likely going to ask you for a TIFF file. And this is because the very large files allow for the detail necessary to print larger products. Now, when you're using illustrations, there are some key tips for you to use. The first is that you only ever want to use one style of illustration within a project. In fact, it can be very helpful for your brand to only have one style, regardless of project or campaign, so that that style of illustration becomes part of your brand voice. So if you're using vector images in one campaign, you probably want to use vectors for other things. Similar to using Sketch in one campaign, you would want to use Sketch illustrations in others, so it becomes part of your visual brand. And you want to try to use the same ones over and over again to create brand identity. In fact, most logos are actually illustrations. Some may have text combined with them, but you could probably identify a lot of these logo design and illustrations without the text being on them, such as Pepsi, KFC, Burger King, and even Harvard's Shield. Now, we often want to use illustrations, particularly in larger designs or very detailed, information heavy designs. You want to use illustrations to replace the words with images so that you use less words and allow the reader to follow your idea through images. Because again, images are the first thing that your viewer is going to notice. So if you can lead the eye to a section with an image, it really helps other people to have a sense of flow and layout with the rest of your design. This is particularly important for things like infographics, PowerPoint designs, and things of that nature. So make sure that anytime you could use an illustration instead of a word, that you're doing so effectively. Now, you can also use illustrations, particularly artistic ones, to really surprise the audience and capture attention. Uh, because artistic representations of things tend to draw our eye and breed creativity from your viewer, you want to use these sparingly so they're not too distracting, but to draw your audience in. You can also use images or illustrations to draw your viewer's eye to where you want it to go on the page. Notice how the illustration here has the illustrated people looking at the headline and even having someone pointing to your subheading. This automatically draws your eye away from the image to the art of hiring. So, therefore, you can really use illustration to draw your audience's eye wherever you want it to go. So now that you understand a little bit more about illustration and photography from part one, make sure you do your discussion on visuals and then read the chapters on basic layout and hierarchy that are posted in Canvas. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your week.